Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the second in our two-part 10 Essential Film Scores for Beginners. Now, since this has two parts and there are 10 in each, it's not 10 Essential Film Scores for Beginners in both cases, but it is, and this is how it is. In the first video, I mentioned that these film scores, the ones I talked about in that first video, were film scores by composers who specialized in writing film scores. The second video, which is this one, is film scores by composers who were famous classical composers who also wrote the occasional film score, a different group. And so these will be more familiar names if you know classical music. Now, I have to wag my finger once again, because I've had to throughout this series. I have asked and asked and asked all of you to please do not add things to the list. Do not say you forgot this, or I want that, or I like this. Talk about the things on the list. 10 is plenty. It's enough. It's enough for anyone who's seriously beginning. It will take them weeks, if not months, to get through all of this stuff at their leisure or whatever pace they want to move. And it is not helpful to just throw more stuff out there. Let's get started, shall we? 10 major film scores by major classical composers who, some of them spent a good deal of time writing film music. Some of them it was a one-off thing, but they're all masterpieces. So you ready? Copland, The Red Pony, the Steinbeck story. Oh, this is wonderful. You know, Copland invented the American sound of the West kind of orchestration and stuff. And he used that style to perfection. And there's a suite, as in most of these things. Sometimes you get original full-length soundtracks. Sometimes you just get the suite. And this is just a marvelous, marvelous example of Copland's Americana style at its absolute best. It is so catchy. Oh my God, it's catchy and fun to listen to and brilliantly scored. It's just genius. So Copland's The Red Pony is something you really need to hear. And this is the concert suite. Don't worry about the complete thing. Prokofiev, Lieutenant Kijé. Now, a whole bunch of you chimed in after the last one and said, you forgot Prokofiev. You didn't mention Alexander Nevsky. Well, I did. Alexander Nevsky is in our essential list for, oratorios and cantatas. It's in there. It's just not in the movie music list because it belongs in both. And I decided to talk about it there. So now we're talking about a different Prokofiev film score, Lieutenant Kijé, which is just wonderful and which was used quite extensively by Woody Allen in his movie Love and Death, especially the troika. It's wonderful. This also occurs on a non-beginner's list, which is 10 pieces of music with vocal parts that are better without the words. Because in the movie, some of these numbers are songs. But for concert performance, Prokofiev made the vocal parts optional. And oh, that's so much better without the singing. It really is. And let's not have that discussion again about whether you like the singing or not. I'm telling you, if you see a soloist on the record when you're getting it, get the one that doesn't mention the soloist. You want to hear just the orchestral part. It's delicious. Next, Benjamin Britten, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. Believe it or not, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, which you can get with or without narration, get it without narration, please, is a film score. It was written for a documentary called The Instruments of the Orchestra, in which each variation of the basic theme, which is a theme by Henry Purcell, is used to illustrate a different orchestral instrument. And put all together, you have a fabulous theme and variations for orchestra that has created, it has an entirely independent existence as one of the great, didactic masterpieces of Western music, and just a heck of a lot of fun anyway for normal performance in concert. But it was a film score. And I think that's kind of interesting. Not a lot of people know that, but it was. After that, number 4, Shostakovich, The Gadfly. We have to talk about The Gadfly. Now, Shostakovich wrote film scores throughout his career, and he did it for quite a while after he was in disgrace with the authorities to earn a living. He had to, and so he did a lot of sort of socialist, realist, junky films. But his film music is actually often quite interesting because he liked to write in closed forms. In other words, he would see how long it had to be, and he would write a fully formed piece with its own internal structure of the appropriate length. And so you get you get with Shostakovich film scores that have a pretty serious independent existence as often as not. But the Gadfly is the romance from the Gadfly. There's a movement called Romance, was the theme to Riley, Ace of Spies, and it became hugely famous in that form. And so that's why I'm mentioning it now, just as a typical example of Shostakovich's film music. And it's a big piece. It's over a half hour long, I think, in most performances, and it's delightful to listen to. I mean, Shostakovich had a genuine populist idiom, very different from his more serious and sometimes depressing symphonic idiom. And so, it tends to be poo-pooed by people, and it was poo-pooed by Shostakovich, who often, felt that it was just junk that he dashed off. But, geniuses, their genius manifests itself in interesting ways. And so even what Shostakovich might have considered throwaway stuff can actually be quite marvelously written, because he was such a superb craftsman and such a natural writer for the orchestra. He didn't work at the piano. He just wrote directly into full score, basically. I mean, he had that kind of a mind. And so all of his orchestral music, I think, is interesting for that reason. So yes, the Gadfly. Next, Hindemith. Yeah, Hindemith. He actually wrote a movie score. Paul Hindemith, the serious German, first half of the 20th century major composer guy. And it's called Im Kampf mit dem Berg, which means in conflict or struggle with the mountain. It's about a mountain thing. You're going up the mountain and it's struggling because of how you're getting snow and sleet and cliffs and danger. And it's a wonderful piece. It was only discovered actually rather recently, in the past couple of decades. There's a suite or excerpts from it, and it's been recorded a couple of times. And the complete score was also recorded. This is one of the very, very earliest original scores ever written for a silent film. I believe it was written in the early 20s. And it's wonderful. It doesn't sound anything like later Hindemith, if you know what Hindemith sounds like. I don't expect that you need to, but he became a very, very serious German composer who found a sort of rapprochement between contemporary music and German folk music, and he had his own sort of theory about what music should sound like. And the joke is, you begin with an easy C major chord, then you go crazy, and then you end with a C major chord. But this doesn't sound like that. This is just a film score, and a very, very colorful and interesting one. So I wanted to throw it in there because Hindemith's a major, major composer. And so you should have an opportunity to hear his film music, because you're going to encounter him in your peregrinations through the world of classical music. After Hindemith, Malcolm Arnold. Oh, Malcolm Arnold's wonderful. Malcolm Arnold was one of the great 20th century composers. He was an English composer. He's most famous for his soundtrack to, here it is, The Bridge on the River Kwai. You know that movie where they have to blow up the rail bridge that the enemy is using, and one of the guys is sent there to ensure that it gets destroyed, but there are a bunch of prisoners of war who are trying to keep their morale up, and so they keep their morale up by building this bridge. They take real pride in it until they realize what they've done to aid the enemy, and so ultimately they wind up blowing up their own bridge. Oh, it's a fabulous movie. It really is. The big tune is not by Malcolm Arnold. The big tune is the Colonel Bogey March by William Alford, or Kenneth Alford, or his name was Alford. And I think it's Kenneth Alford, yeah. The one that goes, Comet, it turns your sink all green. Comet, I'd rather use Mr. Clean. Comet, it makes you vomit. That thing, remember that tune? And that's the tune. But Malcolm Arnold wrote all the rest of it besides that tune. And what a brilliant score it was. He did a lot of film music, and he was a genius as an orchestral colorist and a tunesmith. So he was perfect as a film music composer. And there are discs of his film music, and I really recommend that you get them and listen to this stuff. You'll enjoy it enormously. But The Bridge on the River Kwai is, of course, the big famous one. Then William Walton. Now, Walton's film music, he had a period in his life where he did a lot of film music scoring, mostly for Laurence Olivier films, the Shakespeare films, the histories. And the most famous of those is Henry V. There's a suite that Walton himself made. There are longer, sort of with narration descriptions, with a lot more of the music that he wrote. He was a wonderful, wonderful composer for that repertoire, for those British Shakespeare history film score things with Laurence Olivier. He also did some World War II stuff. There's a fantastic piece called Spitfire, the Prelude and Fugue, which is a documentary about the building of the British Air Force. Spitfire being one of the fighter planes. So yeah, it's good stuff. And Henry V is just wonderful. And after Walton's, we're moving very quickly through these because you could just look at the list and sample to your heart's content. Arthur Honegger. Now, Arthur Honegger was a major French composer. He's probably best known these days for a tone poem called Pacific 231, which is the greatest ever representation of a train. It's starting up going chugga, 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 then it pulls on the brakes. It's only about 6 minutes long. His third symphony, the Liturgique, is also very, very powerful, a response to the desolation of the Second World War. I mean, he was really, really a fine composer. And he wrote a lot of movie music as well. He was very interested in the cinema. His most famous film score is probably Les Misérables. No, not the Broadway Eurotrash musical by Jean-Michel Schoenberg and other people like that. No, not at all. This is the actual original French film. And the score is very extensive. It's a big, long work with lots of different sections. And Honegger was a little bit like Shostakovich in the sense that he was very concerned with form, with counterpoint. He had a very distinctive and personal style, but he was able to adapt it marvelously to the demands of the cinema. And he also was a dense composer. In other words, he was able to squeeze a lot into a small space, to create atmosphere, with the stroke of a pen like this, which is, one of the essential gifts of a film composer. So you probably will enjoy his score to Les Misérables, the Victor Hugo masterpiece. And a masterpiece of film writing, it certainly is. Next, let's see. Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein did On the Waterfront. That famous movie, and he arranged a symphonic suite. I think he called it a symphonic suite in 3 movements from the film On the Waterfront. Now, Bernstein was a one-shot wonder. He only did that one film score. If you discount, the movies made of his musicals, On the Town and West Side Story and whatnot, in which he had some limited role. But an actual original film score, On the Waterfront, is a complete work of genius. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece that works totally well, fabulously away from the screen. It's just basically a 3-movement tone poem for orchestra, but it's so wonderfully captures the dark, seamy, jazzy, undercurrent of violence, and it's terrific. Great movie too. It helps when you have a great score to a great film. But last but not least, one of the all-time superbo masterpieces of film music, Vaughn Williams, his Symphony No. 7, the Sinfonia Antarctica. Now, the Sinfonia Antarctica began life as the score to the film Scott of the Antarctic. About Scott's fated journey. They die, they freeze to death, just literally feet away from their base. But they couldn't see where they were because they were in a blizzard and they died. It was his attempt to reach the Arctic Circle, and it failed. And they recovered his diary, and he knew they were all going to die. And it's a very moving story, and it's a wonderful movie. And the score is amazing. Oh my God! It's all the icicles and glaciers and penguins hopping around, and it's terrific. And out of this large film score, which has been recorded in its original form, it's on the Dutton label. Vaughn Williams created an actual 5-movement symphony, which is about, man versus nature, which is, after all, what the movie's about. But it's arranged into a much more shapely form, and it follows the same basic narrative thread as the movie. It ends tragically with the empty Arctic waste, and it has offstage chorus and creepy moaning sopranos and a wind machine going and tons of glittery percussion for the glacier, and you've got a big organ coming in when you're up on the glacier. And oh my goodness, it's just phenomenal. It's an amazing piece of film music, and he turned it into an amazingly evocative and incredibly successful symphony. It's really terrific. So, and you get it as a symphony. You can get the film score if you want, but it's so much more satisfying to hear it in symphonic form because he's shaped it into something. It doesn't just sort of run one episode into the other without ever telling us exactly where we are in it. Here you have defined sections with a specific mood, while at the same time covering the same emotional terrain as the movie does. It's really a brilliant achievement, and it's rather underrated, I think. But certainly one of the most skillful adaptations of film music to another purpose, to a completely independent life as an abstract-ish. It's not really abstract, descriptive, but a different work in a larger, more successful, purely musical medium, away from the visuals. A total work of genius, and I recommend it very strongly. And that, my friends, is the list of 10 completely phenomenal film scores by composers who were not essentially, and in most of their lives and careers, film score composers. But they're masterpieces nonetheless. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.